Scott Hayden, and I'm here to talk to you here for the History US 530 course on the history of the United States and Canada from a Christian perspective. I'm here in my office, if you want to call it my office, at the high school I work at, where I teach junior ROTC to about 180 cadets. And the reason why I bring up junior ROTC to begin this is because it's developed something along the lines of a community. And with this community, it has got leadership, it's got a centralized location. And with that location, the cadets tend to congregate. And that congregation, if you will, of cadets has a set form of leadership. That's something that we try to teach here in junior ROTC and the just so that they can grow up and become productive citizens. It's sort of the same concept of how the Puritans in 17th century New England built their towns, with their towns beginning with the one in New Haven, Connecticut. And if you have your textbooks open, you'll see on page 41 of the Knoll book that the Puritans set up a town square type of town, if you will, where you had the center of the town had what was called the town square, and that town square in the middle of it was the church. And it was that church that everyone tended to revolve around. And that was what was referenced to as the New England way. And on page 42 of the Knoll book, Knoll goes on to say that the New England way was a very Calvinistic form of Christianity. And I referenced the Perry Miller article, and on page 41, 411 of his article, he talks about that Calvinism. Not specifically about tulip, but when it comes to predestination, that form of Calvinism that the Puritans heavily believed in. It was that predestination that ultimately defined whether or not a person was saved in that community, and that salvation thus equated into membership in the church. And ultimately, if you're a member of the church, you pretty much had full rights throughout the entire town, especially in the example here of New Haven, Connecticut that I chose to use out of the Knoll book. But there was a time, and this was in many different communities. I'm not going to pick one in particular, but there was a moment in time in the Peterson article that I chose on page 575, where there was a lack of leadership. The main pastor, if you will, was not there, or the pastor that was there to fill that gap wasn't university trained, so they didn't have the full knowledge of all the things that were important to the congregation, especially in the form of the sacraments, because Puritanism essentially was a distant offshoot of Catholicism because of the Protestant Reformation. However, in some of the sacraments were still indeed practiced. Sacraments such as baptism and communion were still practiced on a routine basis. And when the members were deprived of those sacraments, they felt as if they were neglected. And that neglect resulted in churches and towns falling downwards in population. Those sacraments, as they saw it, were necessary to keep the church active and viable in the community. And that's also found in the Peterson article on page 577. But as with any community, time usually has its way on that community. And with time, they had to develop their, they had to redo some of the ways of thinking. It resulted in something that they came up with called the halfway covenant. And that halfway covenant basically allowed people in the second and third generations membership within the church without having to go through all the strict covenants. So given that, with the New England way and Puritanism, what happened with New Haven, Connecticut as the source for my small little 5-minute video, which, by the way, is the first time I've ever had to do a video for an assignment. So I hope you were able to get something out of what I was able to say today about how the church was the builder of the social bonds for community fellowship, and that's the basis of my assignment for this week's discussion board. Thank you very much for partaking in my video, and we'll see you in a few weeks.